The autumn sun barely peeked through Dr. Maya Richardson's home office window as she rehearsed her presentation one final time. Her desk, usually pristine, now displayed an organized chaos of economic reports, research papers, and 3 empty coffee cups. The Federal Reserve Board wouldn't just be listening to her new economic theory today. They'd be scrutinizing every detail, every prediction, and every conclusion she'd drawn from 5 years of intensive research. At 42, Dr. Richardson had already achieved what many economists spent their entire careers pursuing. Her groundbreaking work on urban economic development had earned her recognition from presidents and prime ministers alike. Yet this morning's presentation felt different. This theory could revolutionize how cities approached economic growth, potentially lifting millions out of poverty. A message notification lit up her phone screen. Dr. Richardson, the board members are particularly interested in your urban mobility correlation data. Looking forward to your presentation. Chairman Stevens. She smiled, remembering her early days as a junior economist when such messages would have sent her into a spiral of anxiety. Now they only fueled her confidence. Glancing at her Apple Watch, 8:45 a.m., Maya gathered her materials with practiced efficiency. Her Tesla Model S waited in the driveway, freshly charged and ready for the 30-minute drive to the Federal Reserve Building. She planned everything meticulously, her route, her timing, even her power suit, a tailored charcoal gray ensemble that projected both authority and approachability. The morning traffic flowed surprisingly well as she navigated through the city's main arteries. Her car's GPS suddenly chimed, suggesting a faster route through the historic district due to an accident ahead on her usual path. Maya accepted the reroute without hesitation. Being early was part of her professional DNA. The historic district's charm never failed to capture her attention. Victorian mansions lined the streets, their architectural details telling stories of a bygone era. As she admired a particularly well-preserved home, her Tesla's navigation system guided her through unfamiliar streets, each turn taking her through increasingly quiet neighborhoods. Maya found herself in a residential area she'd never visited before, despite having lived in the city for over a decade. The streets here were narrow, lined with towering oak trees whose branches created natural archways overhead. She noted how the neighborhood's design perfectly illustrated her theory about urban planning's impact on community development. Lost in professional observation, she almost missed the flash of blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat as she checked her speed, perfectly legal at 25 miles per hour. She signaled and pulled over smoothly, her mind already calculating how this delay would affect her carefully planned schedule. As she waited for the officer to approach, Maya took slow, measured breaths. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the Federal Reserve Board, this time from Dr. Thompson, her former mentor. Conference room is prepared for your presentation. The international video feed is already being tested. The gravity of what awaited her at the Federal Reserve Building weighed heavily against this unexpected delay. She gathered her license and registration, maintaining her characteristic composure despite the circumstances. Through her side mirror, she watched the officer approach, his steps deliberate and measured. Maya's fingers drummed lightly on her steering wheel as she reminded herself that every interaction was an opportunity for positive engagement. She built her career on turning challenging situations into stepping stones for progress. Still, as she lowered her window and greeted the officer with a professional smile, she couldn't shake the feeling that this morning had more surprises in store. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves into her car as she waited, her presentation materials safely tucked in their leather portfolio on the passenger seat. In just a few hours, she would be discussing economic theories that could reshape urban development across the globe. But first, she had to navigate this unexpected detour in her perfectly planned morning. Judge William Hartley's courtroom hummed with the familiar morning energy he'd grown accustomed to over his 15 years on the bench. The wood-paneled walls seemed to absorb the whispered conversations of attorneys, defendants, and court officers as they prepared for another busy day. He adjusted his reading glasses, scanning the morning docket with practiced efficiency. From his elevated position, Judge Hartley observed the usual Monday morning crowd filling the benches. His reputation for running a tight schedule meant most people arrived early, not daring to test his strict punctuality policy. The digital clock on his desk read 9:30 a.m. sharp when he nodded to his bailiff to begin the morning session. Sarah Chen, his trusted clerk for the past 5 years, approached the bench with a fresh stack of case files. "Interesting morning ahead," she whispered, sliding a particularly thick folder onto his desk. 27 traffic cases, 3 small claims, and that zoning dispute from last week. Judge Hartley acknowledged her update with a slight nod, already immersed in reviewing the first case. The morning proceeded like a well-orchestrated symphony. Each case received exactly the attention it required. No more, no less. Judge Hartley took pride in his ability to read situations quickly and deliver fair, efficient judgments. His colleagues often joked that he could determine the outcome of a traffic case just by watching how a person walked to the podium. Case number 2023-TR-255, Sarah announced clearly, her voice carrying through the courtroom. Dr. Maya Richardson, charged with failing to observe a stop sign, Historic District, October 15th. Judge Hartley glanced at the thin file before him, noting the officer's detailed report. His eyes skimmed over the basic information. Clean driving record, no previous citations, proper documentation provided at the scene. Standard fare for a Monday morning. The gentle click of heels against the courtroom's marble floor drew his attention. A woman approached the podium, her presence somehow different from the nervous energy he usually encountered. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, her posture suggesting confidence rather than the typical apprehension he witnessed in traffic court. "Good morning, Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and measured. Judge Hartley continued reviewing the citation, his pen poised to make notes. In his peripheral vision, he noticed several attorneys in the gallery paying unusual attention to this seemingly routine traffic case. Sarah shifted slightly beside him, an almost imperceptible movement that caught his attention. She placed a newspaper clipping on top of his papers, something she'd never done before. His eyes fell on a headline from last week's business section. Dr. Maya Richardson's economic theory catches international attention. Judge Hartley maintained his composed expression, though his interest was piqued. In his courtroom, however, everyone received the same treatment. He'd learned early in his career that true justice required consistency, regardless of who stood before him. "Dr. Richardson," he addressed her, his tone carrying the same professional detachment he used with the previous 20 cases that morning. "The officer's report indicates you failed to come to a complete stop at the intersection of Maple and 3rd Street. Do you understand the charge against you?" The woman before him nodded, reaching into her leather portfolio. "Yes, Your Honor. I've prepared a brief explanation of the circumstances, including satellite imagery of the intersection in question and traffic pattern data that I believe is relevant to this case." A slight murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hartley raised an eyebrow. In 15 years, no one had ever offered traffic pattern data as evidence in his court. He checked his watch, acutely aware of the remaining cases on his docket. The morning's careful scheduling suddenly felt precarious. Sarah cleared her throat softly, a subtle reminder of their efficient courtroom protocol. Yet something about Dr. Richardson's composed demeanor and methodical approach gave him pause. The next few minutes, he sensed, might not follow his usual script for traffic citations. Dr. Richardson stood at the podium with practiced poise, her leather portfolio open before her. The morning sunlight, streaming through the high courtroom windows, caught the subtle gold threading in her suit jacket, a detail Judge Hartley found himself noticing despite his determination to treat this as any other traffic case. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the same authority she used in lecture halls worldwide. "I understand the gravity of any traffic violation, particularly in a historic district. However, I believe the unique circumstances of that morning deserve consideration." Judge Hartley glanced at his watch, 10:15 a.m. He had 12 more cases to hear before noon. Dr. Richardson, the officer's report clearly states you failed to come to a complete stop. These are straightforward matters. He shuffled the papers before him, ready to pronounce the standard fine. With respect, Your Honor, Dr. Richardson continued, removing a precisely organized set of documents from her portfolio. The intersection in question presents some interesting anomalies. I've analyzed the traffic patterns and visibility factors. Dr. Richardson, Judge Hartley interrupted, his tone carrying the weight of 15 years of similar conversations. While I appreciate your thorough approach, this court has a specific procedure for traffic violations. The officer's observation is considered primary evidence. A subtle shift occurred in Dr. Richardson's demeanor. Her spine straightened almost imperceptibly, and her eyes took on the sharp focus she usually reserved for challenging economic theories. Your Honor, perhaps I could draw a parallel between traffic law enforcement and economic policy implementation. Sarah Chen, the clerk, looked up from her computer, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. In the gallery, several attorneys leaned forward, their interest piqued by this unusual exchange. Judge Hartley felt a flicker of irritation at the disruption of his carefully maintained courtroom rhythm. The fine is $300, he stated firmly, his gavel hovering above its wooden base. Payable to the clerk's office by the end of business today. Dr. Richardson calmly placed her documents back in her portfolio. I understand, Your Honor. I'll need a detailed receipt for my presentation this afternoon. The Federal Reserve Board is particularly interested in real-world examples of systematic decision-making processes. Judge Hartley's gavel paused mid-air. A memory surfaced. This morning's newspaper article about a groundbreaking economic presentation to the Federal Reserve. He pushed the thought aside, maintaining his professional demeanor. The clerk will provide you with all necessary documentation, Dr. Richardson. As she gathered her materials, Dr. Richardson's expression remained perfectly composed. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll be sure to include this interaction in my analysis of urban socioeconomic dynamics. Sometimes the most illuminating data comes from unexpected sources. The gallery stirred again, and Judge Hartley noticed several people scribbling notes. His courtroom had never felt quite so much like a fishbowl. Next case, he called out, perhaps a bit more forcefully than necessary. Dr. Richardson turned to leave, her heels clicking against the marble floor with measured precision. At the courtroom doors, she paused briefly to answer a whispered question from one of the attorneys, her response too quiet to hear, but causing several heads to nod in understanding. Judge Hartley found himself watching her exit, an unusual sense of unease settling over him. Sarah placed the next case file before him, but included with it was another newspaper clipping. This one detailing Dr. Richardson's recent nomination for the Presidential Medal of Economic Innovation. Your Honor, Sarah whispered, your judicial conference presentation begins at 2 o'clock. The topic was modern approaches to judicial decision-making, correct? The irony wasn't lost on him. Judge Hartley straightened his robes and cleared his throat. Next case, 2023 TR 256. He announced, his voice steady despite the nagging feeling that his next conference might prove more interesting than anticipated. As he proceeded with the morning docket, Dr. Richardson's words about systematic decision-making echoed in his mind. For the first time in years, his courtroom's efficient rhythm felt oddly out of sync. The State Judicial Leadership Summit's grand ballroom buzzed with activity as judges from across the state found their assigned seats. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the gathered legal minds, their black robes replaced by business attire for this annual conference. Judge William Hartley adjusted his tie as he located his place card in the front row. William, saved you some coffee, Judge Patricia Martinez called from the adjacent seat, sliding a steaming cup his way. Heard you had a full docket this morning. Must have been interesting. Several attorneys from your courtroom arrived early to grab seats in the back. Judge Hartley's brow furrowed slightly as he noticed, indeed, several familiar faces from his morning session scattered throughout the audience. He pulled out the conference agenda, eager to change the subject. The keynote speaker's credentials caught his attention: 3 presidential medals, advisory roles to the World Bank, and a recent Nobel nomination in economics. Quite a speaker they've lined up, Patricia commented, peering over at his agenda. Apparently, they had to reschedule the entire conference just to accommodate her schedule. The governor himself made the call to ensure she could present today. The summit director approached the podium, tapping the microphone gently. The room fell into an expectant hush, the kind that preceded truly significant moments. Distinguished members of the judiciary, honored guests, we are privileged today to host one of the most influential voices in modern economic theory and social policy. Judge Hartley sipped his coffee, appreciating its premium quality, a far cry from the courthouse brew. He noticed several state Supreme Court justices entering through a side door, an unusual occurrence at these typically routine conferences. Our speaker's latest research, the director continued, has fundamentally changed how we understand the relationship between institutional decision-making and economic outcomes. Her work has influenced policy at the highest levels of government, and today she'll share insights particularly relevant to judicial practice. The coffee suddenly felt bitter in Judge Hartley's mouth as a familiar sensation of unease crept over him. He reached for the conference brochure, scanning for the speaker's name he'd somehow overlooked earlier. Her presentation to the Federal Reserve Board this morning has already generated significant discussion in policy circles, the director added, beaming with obvious pride. We're extraordinarily fortunate that she agreed to come directly from that meeting to share her insights with us. Judge Hartley's hand froze midway through turning the brochure page. Federal Reserve Board. This morning. The weight of realization descended just as the director's voice rose with enthusiasm. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Maya Richardson, recipient of the Presidential Medal of Economic Innovation and architect of the Urban Economic Impact Theory. The room erupted in applause as a figure rose from the side seating area. Judge Hartley's coffee cup trembled slightly in his hand as he watched Dr. Richardson approach the podium, wearing the same impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit from his courtroom mere hours ago. She moved with the same composed grace he witnessed earlier, but now the full weight of her presence commanded the room. The morning's traffic court seemed a lifetime away as she arranged her materials, the same leather portfolio, on the podium. Thank you for that warm welcome, Dr. Richardson began, her voice carrying effortlessly through the ballroom. Today, we'll explore how individual decisions within our institutional frameworks cascade through society's economic fabric. In fact, I had a rather illuminating experience just this morning that perfectly illustrates our topic. Judge Hartley sank slightly lower in his seat as several heads turned in his direction. Patricia leaned over, whispering, "William, isn't that the woman from your traffic court? The one with the traffic pattern analysis?" Before he could respond, Dr. Richardson's opening slide appeared on the massive screen behind her. The Economic Impact of Systematic Decision-Making, a case study in judicial process. A gentle murmur rippled through the ballroom as Dr. Richardson's presentation title remained displayed on the massive screen. Judge Hartley found himself studying the elaborate carpet pattern, hyper-aware of the occasional glances darting his way from colleagues who had connected the dots between the morning's traffic court and this moment. In our institutions, Dr. Richardson began, her voice carrying the same measured confidence it had in traffic court, we often rely on efficiency as a metric of success. But today, I'd like to explore the hidden costs of rapid decision-making in our justice system. The room fell into rapt attention as she advanced to her first data slide. Graphs and charts illuminated the screen, displaying correlations between judicial processing times and economic impacts on communities. Judge Hartley's discomfort began to shift into professional interest as he recognized the sophistication of her research. Consider a routine traffic court, she continued, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. On average, cases are processed in under 5 minutes. This morning, I had the opportunity to experience this efficiency firsthand in Judge Hartley's courtroom. Several heads turned toward him again, But Dr. Richardson smoothly continued, her tone remaining professional and engaging. While efficient processing might seem beneficial, our research reveals interesting patterns in how these brief interactions ripple through community trust and economic behavior. Judge Patricia Martinez scribbled furiously in her notebook beside him, pausing only to whisper, "William, she's brilliant. Did you really dismiss her traffic pattern analysis?" Her pen hovered expectantly over the paper, but Judge Hartley remained focused on the presentation, his earlier embarrassment giving way to genuine fascination. Dr. Richardson clicked to the next slide, revealing a complex economic model. When we examine the data from 50 major urban courts, we find that increased decision-making time correlates with higher community engagement and improved economic outcomes. She paused, making eye contact with various members of the audience. Sometimes, the most valuable insights come from taking an extra moment to consider alternative perspectives. The state Supreme Court justices in the front row nodded appreciatively. Judge Hartley noticed one of them writing mandatory training material in bold letters on their conference notepad. The implications of how this morning's interaction might become a teaching moment in judicial education weren't lost on him. Let's examine a specific case study, Dr. Richardson continued, advancing to a detailed analysis of a familiar intersection, Maple and 3rd Street. The satellite imagery she had attempted to share in traffic court now filled the screen, accompanied by sophisticated traffic flow analyses and economic impact data. Judge Hartley sat straighter in his chair as the evidence he had dismissed earlier was presented with compelling clarity. The intersection's unique challenges, the impact of morning sun angle on visibility, and the correlation between traffic enforcement patterns and local business activity formed a comprehensive picture he wished he had taken the time to consider. When we rushed to judgment, Dr. Richardson observed, her gaze sweeping the room, we miss opportunities to understand the broader context of our decisions. This morning's experience provides a perfect example of how institutional efficiency, while valuable, must be balanced with thorough consideration. The presentation continued, but Judge Hartley found himself reflecting on his years on the bench. How many other detailed analyses had he dismissed in the name of efficiency? How many voices had he silenced with his gavel, assuming he already knew what they would say? As Dr. Richardson moved into the next section of her presentation, a cell phone buzzed quietly in the audience. Judge Hartley noticed one of the attorneys from his morning session checking a message, then suppressing a smile. The attorney leaned over to his colleague, whispering something that made them both glance at the Federal Reserve's public announcement page. Dr. Richardson's morning presentation had apparently made quite an impression. The words groundbreaking methodology and immediate policy review floated through the whispered conversation. Judge Hartley realized he had witnessed only a fraction of this remarkable woman's impact today, and his 5-minute dismissal of her evidence seemed increasingly short-sighted. Dr. Richardson's presentation moved into its central theme, her slides now displaying intricate economic models that captured the room's attention. Judge Hartley found himself leaning forward, absorbed by the elegant way she connected seemingly unrelated data points into a compelling narrative about justice and community impact. "Consider this pattern," she said, highlighting a graph that showed the relationship between judicial decision timing and community trust metrics. When citizens feel heard, even if the final decision goes against them, their engagement with local institutions increases by 43%. Her laser pointer traced the upward curve with precision. The Supreme Court justice, sitting nearby, nudged his colleague, whispering something about revolutionary implications. Judge Hartley noticed his fellow judges taking photographs of the slides with their phones, something usually discouraged at these conferences but seemingly impossible to resist given the groundbreaking nature of the data. This morning at the Federal Reserve, Dr. Richardson continued, smoothly connecting her earlier presentation to this one. We discussed how institutional behaviors ripple through economic systems. A single 5-minute interaction can trigger effects lasting months or even years. Judge Hartley's pen paused over his notepad as the significance of her words sank in. He'd had thousands of 5-minute interactions over his career, each one a potential catalyst for broader change. The weight of this realization settled heavily on his shoulders. A hand rose from the middle of the audience. Dr. Richardson, could you elaborate on how these findings might influence daily court procedures? The question came from Judge Martinez's mentor, a respected senior judge known for his innovative approaches to justice. Dr. Richardson's response was measured yet powerful. Imagine each courtroom interaction as a stone dropped in a pond. The ripples affect not just the individual before us, but their family, their workplace, their community. Our research shows that when people leave a courtroom feeling their perspective was genuinely considered, they're 60% more likely to engage positively with other civic institutions. She clicked to a new slide showing a familiar intersection, Maple and 3rd, but now annotated with complex economic data. Take this morning's traffic stop location. Within a 2-block radius, we find 3 small businesses, a community center, and a daycare facility. Each traffic enforcement decision here affects foot traffic patterns, shopping behaviors, and community gathering habits. The room absorbed this information in thoughtful silence. Judge Hartley recalled how quickly he dismissed her attempt to present this very data in his courtroom. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been so focused on efficiency that he'd missed an opportunity to understand his own jurisdiction better. But perhaps most compelling, Dr. Richardson continued, her voice carrying a note of passionate expertise, is the correlation between perceived procedural fairness and economic stability. When community members believe local institutions respect their time and perspectives, we see measurable increases in small business growth, property values, and civic participation. The presentation screen filled with a series of time-lapse maps showing economic development patterns. Judge Hartley recognized his own courthouse at the center of one visualization, watching as waves of economic impact, both positive and negative, rippled outward from that single point. Each decision we make, she emphasized, making eye contact with various audience members, carries weight beyond its immediate context. A traffic fine isn't just a punishment or a deterrent. It's a moment of interaction between institutions and community members that shapes future behaviors and economic choices. From his front row seat, Judge Hartley could see the subtle changes in her expression as she presented. The same quiet confidence he'd encountered in his courtroom now amplified by the weight of her expertise and research. He found himself wondering how many other professionals he'd encountered in his courtroom had depths he'd never taken the time to discover. The gentle buzz of phones continued as attendees discreetly shared insights from the presentation with colleagues unable to attend. Dr. Richardson's morning Federal Reserve presentation was already making headlines on legal and economic news sites, her findings described as paradigm-shifting and foundational to future policy discussions. As the summit broke for lunch, the grand ballroom transformed into a networking space filled with animated discussions about Dr. Richardson's presentation. Judges gathered in small groups, tablets and phones displaying her data slides as they debated the implications for their own courtrooms. Judge Hartley stood at the edges of these conversations, his usual confidence replaced by thoughtful reflection. Dr. Richardson had taken a seat at a corner table, her leather portfolio open as she reviewed notes with 2 Supreme Court justices. Their enthusiastic gestures suggested they were already exploring ways to implement her research findings. A steady stream of conference attendees approached her table, each waiting patiently for a moment of her time. Judge Martinez appeared at Hartley's elbow, holding 2 plates from the buffet. "William," she said quietly, "sometimes the hardest steps are the most important ones." She nodded toward Dr. Richardson's table. "And sometimes they're exactly what we need to become better at what we do." Taking a deep breath, Judge Hartley straightened his tie and made his way across the room. As he approached, Dr. Richardson looked up from her conversation, her expression professional and welcoming, exactly as it had been in his courtroom hours earlier. "Dr. Richardson," he began, his voice carrying the sincerity of hard-earned wisdom, "I wonder if you might have a moment to discuss your research in more detail." The Supreme Court justices exchanged knowing looks and graciously excused themselves, leaving space at the table. "Of course, Judge Hartley," she replied, gesturing to an empty chair. "I believe we both had quite an educational morning." Her tone carried no hint of reproach, only the measured interest of a scholar engaged in meaningful dialogue. As he sat down, Judge Hartley noticed her traffic court receipt placed carefully beside her presentation materials. "I must admit," he said, "your analysis of the Maple and Third intersection was far more comprehensive than I initially understood. Perhaps if I had taken the time to review your evidence." Dr. Richardson smiled, pulling out the same satellite imagery she'd attempted to share earlier. "You know, Judge Hartley, in economics we often talk about revealed preferences, how people's true priorities are shown through their actions rather than their words. Your courtroom efficiency reveals a deep commitment to public service, a commitment that sometimes comes at the cost of fuller understanding," he acknowledged, studying the traffic pattern data with new appreciation. "Your research makes a compelling case for balancing efficiency with engagement." Their conversation drew interested observers. Several judges pulled up chairs, turning the discussion into an impromptu workshop on incorporating economic impact analysis into judicial decision-making. Dr. Richardson shared stories from her fieldwork in communities across the country, while Judge Hartley offered insights from his years on the bench. "What strikes me most," Judge Hartley noted, "is how our brief interactions can ripple through an entire community. When you mentioned the daycare center near that intersection, it's fascinating, isn't it?" Dr. Richardson responded, pulling up additional data on her tablet. "Each decision point creates waves of influence we rarely see from our institutional perspectives. But when we map them," she showed him a time-lapse visualization of community economic patterns. Their discussion continued, drawing more participants as judges shared similar experiences from their own courtrooms. Dr. Richardson's traffic stop transformed from a potential point of contention into a powerful teaching moment, illustrating how academic research and practical judicial experience could inform each other. As the lunch break drew to a close, Judge Hartley found himself rethinking his afternoon docket. "Dr. Richardson, would you consider visiting our courthouse? Perhaps we could develop a pilot program incorporating some of your research metrics." "I'd be honored," she replied, already making notes in her calendar. After all, the best research comes from collaborative effort between institutions and communities. This morning's experience might have started as a traffic citation, but it's evolved into something far more valuable. Around them, the conference attendees began returning to their seats, many still discussing the morning's revelations. Judge Hartley noticed several of his colleagues already modifying their court procedures on their tablets, inspired by the unexpected intersection of traffic court and economic theory. 6 months later, Judge Hartley's courtroom had undergone a subtle but significant transformation. The morning sun still streamed through the high windows, but now it illuminated a space where efficiency balanced with understanding. A small digital display beside his bench showed real-time community impact metrics, a direct result of his collaboration with Dr. Richardson. Next case, Sarah Chen announced, her role as clerk now expanded to include data collection for their pilot program. The courtroom itself had become a model for innovative judicial practice, drawing observers from across the state who wanted to see the changes firsthand. Judge Hartley smiled as he recalled the path that led here. That chance encounter with Dr. Richardson had sparked a revolution in his approach to justice. The traffic court session that once prided itself on 5-minute resolutions now allocated time based on case complexity and community impact. "Your Honor," a young attorney approached the podium, tablet in hand. "We've prepared an impact analysis for your review." This had become standard practice in his courtroom. Cases now came with optional community context reports, a practice that had already shown promising results in terms of compliance and community engagement. The morning's Washington Post lay folded on his desk, its headline reading, "Revolutionary Court Program Shows Promising Results." The article detailed how the partnership between Dr. Richardson's economic research team and Judge Hartley's court had created a model for justice reform that other jurisdictions were eager to adopt. During the morning recess, Judge Martinez stopped by, as she often did now. "The State Judicial Conference wants to feature our program," she mentioned, setting down her coffee. "They're particularly interested in how the community impact metrics have affected recidivism rates." Judge Hartley nodded, pulling up the latest data on his screen. The numbers told a compelling story. Cases that received thorough consideration showed a 40% improvement in long-term compliance. More surprisingly, community trust in the judicial system had risen significantly in their district. Dr. Richardson's latest paper cites our court specifically, Martinez continued, sliding over an academic journal. She's presenting the findings at Harvard Law next month. Who would have thought a traffic stop could lead to all this? The afternoon brought a familiar face, Dr. Richardson herself, arriving for their monthly program review. She now headed a research team that split time between economic policy and judicial reform, with their courthouse serving as a living laboratory for her theories about institutional interaction and community development. The Federal Reserve is incorporating our metrics into their community development guidelines, she shared, spreading out new data sets on the conference room table. But what's more interesting is how other courts are adapting our model. Together, they reviewed cases from the past month, analyzing patterns and outcomes. The traffic stop that had brought them together had evolved into a framework for understanding how judicial decisions rippled through communities. Their weekly meetings have become a blend of practical court management and innovative social science. "Remember that intersection at Maple and 3rd?" Dr. Richardson asked, pulling up a current photograph. The area had transformed. New businesses had opened, community engagement had increased, and traffic compliance had improved significantly. Sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected challenges. As the day wound down, Judge Hartley prepared for tomorrow's judicial training session. New judges now spent time in his courtroom, learning how to balance efficiency with engagement. His presentation included the story of that October morning, not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of how openness to new perspectives could enhance justice. The sun setting through his chamber windows cast long shadows across his desk, where a framed photo now stood. It showed him and Dr. Richardson at the opening of the Court Innovation Center, a joint venture between the judiciary and leading economic researchers. Their chance encounter had grown into a movement, proving that true justice required both wisdom and willingness to learn. Sarah poked her head in with the next day's docket. "Heavy schedule tomorrow," she noted, "but I think you'll be interested in case number 3. Another economist with some interesting ideas about community impact." Judge Hartley smiled, reaching for the file. He had learned that sometimes the most valuable insights came from the most unexpected moments in court. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new perspectives, and new opportunities to prove that justice worked best when it took time to listen.